The hall trembled under the weight of history as the crown touched William's brow, a moment that should have been triumphant, but chaos erupted instead. Soldiers outside, mistaking the cheers of nobles for rebellion, set fire to nearby buildings, and smoke choked the air as the new King of England was anointed amid screams and confusion. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a fiery omen for a reign that would change Europe forever. William the Conqueror is a name etched in legend, but behind the battles and the Bayeux tapestry lies a man shrouded in mystery, a figure whose life was far stranger, darker, and more surprising than most history books dare to reveal. Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth to uncover 30 astonishing facts about the real William, from his illegitimate birth that nearly cost him everything, to the bizarre omens that followed him like shadows, to the shocking fate of his corpse centuries after death. Think you know the conqueror who reshaped medieval Europe? Prepare to rethink everything. Did you know William once survived a siege by hiding among the dead, his enemies unknowingly stepping over his motionless body? Or that his marriage was a political masterstroke so controversial, the Pope himself tried to tear it apart? This is a story of ruthless ambition, improbable survival, and a legacy so contentious that even his own family turned against him. We'll explore how a boy mocked as William the Bastard defied every odd to become one of history's most feared rulers, and why his blood still flows in the veins of British monarchs today. But this isn't just a tale of swords and conquests. It's about the human drama behind the throne, the betrayals that haunted him, the superstitions that ruled his decisions, and the personal tragedies that no amount of power could undo. Why did William's body explode at his funeral? What secret pact did he make with a rival that changed the course of England? And how did a single mistranslated word during his coronation ignite that fiery disaster we just witnessed? Strap in for a journey into the heart of the Middle Ages, where every fact is a thread in the wild, untold story of the man who dared to claim a kingdom and the price he paid for it. By the end, you'll see William not as a distant figure in a tapestry, but as a flesh and blood warrior whose life was stranger than fiction. Let's begin. Long before he was feared as the conqueror, William entered the world under a cloud of scandal, born to Duke Robert I of Normandy and a woman named Relive, the daughter of a local tanner. In an era where bloodlines meant everything, this wasn't just a social embarrassment, it was a political liability. Imagine the whispers in Norman courts, a future duke with the smell of leather and dye clinging to his lineage. They called him William the Bastard, not just behind his back but to his face, a taunt that followed him like a shadow. But here's what's often overlooked: Relive was no ordinary woman. Though history labels her lowborn, she wielded surprising influence. Some chroniclers suggest Robert was so taken by her that he refused to marry anyone else, even when pressured by nobles. And when William was just a boy, his father made a staggering gamble, leaving Normandy to embark on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, never to return. With no legitimate heir, the duchy fell to an 8-year-old bastard, a decision that threw the region into chaos. Rivals circled like vultures, and assassination plots became as common as breakfast. This wasn't just a childhood, it was a survival course. By 15, William had already survived at least 3 attempts on his life. One desperate escape saw him fleeing through the night, disguised as a peasant, while his guardians were butchered in their beds. Every near miss hardened him. Illegitimacy wasn't just a label, it was a fuel. He'd spend decades proving himself not with words but with steel and shrewd alliances. Even his later conquest of England wasn't just about power, it was about silencing, once and for all, those who'd sneered at his birth. What's fascinating is how he turned shame into strategy. Instead of hiding his roots, he used them. While other nobles relied on stale claims of divine right, William built his reputation on sheer competence. He didn't inherit loyalty, he earned it battle by battle. By the time he set his sights on England, the bastard had become a title worn with pride, a reminder that in a world obsessed with pedigree, willpower could rewrite destiny. And yet, for all his triumphs, that old insult never truly left him. Decades later, as king, he'd still react violently to any mention of it, proof that even conquerors carry scars. The night young William should have died began like any other. With whispered conspiracies, Normandy's nobility saw the boy Duke as an embarrassment, a stain on their honor, and by the time he was 12, at least 3 powerful families had already tried to erase him. But the most chilling attempt came when assassins slipped into his castle at night, their knives glinting as they crept toward the chambers where William slept. What they didn't know, his guardians had caught wind of the plot and hidden him in a peasant's hut, swapping his bed with that of a servant boy. By dawn, William's protectors lay butchered, their blood staining the rushes, while the boy himself watched in horror from a hiding spot so close. He later confessed to hearing the murderers laugh as they wiped their blades. This wasn't isolated brutality, it was Normandy's open secret. One chronicler wrote of nobles playing a macabre game of king-making, betting on which faction would finally succeed in killing the bastard duke. Faced with such relentless threats, William learned to sleep lightly, to trust sparingly. His survival depended on a web of loyalists who smuggled him between safe houses, often disguised as a shepherd or stable hand. One escape was so rushed, he reportedly rode bareback through a snowstorm, his fingers frozen to the reins. Yet the most astonishing detail, these near misses forged his legendary instincts. After surviving an ambush in the Falaise forests where archers emerged from the trees like ghosts, William began studying terrain with obsessive precision, a habit that would later win him battles in England. Even his infamous temper had roots in this era. When a group of knights mocked him during a feast, he didn't just challenge their leader to a duel. He made sure the entire court watched as he humiliated the man, a message carved in steel: the bastard would not be cowed. What's often missed is how these years shaped his ruthlessness. By 15, he'd executed his first traitor, a childhood friend caught conspiring with rivals. The boy who'd once hidden among corpses grew into a man who understood power's darkest arithmetic. Sometimes mercy was just weakness in disguise, and when he finally crushed the rebels who tormented his youth, he didn't just defeat them. He made certain Normandy would never forget who ruled. Castles were razed, lands salted, ringleaders blinded or strangled in their own halls. The message was clear: the boy they'd called prey had become the wolf. But here's the twist: those who expected a tyrant were wrong. William's brush with annihilation gave him something rare in medieval rulers: pragmatism. He pardoned useful enemies, rewarded competence over birthright, and even forgave a would-be assassin who confessed mid-swing, impressed by the man's honesty. Survival had taught him the difference between cruelty and calculation, and when he finally stood on the cliffs of Normandy, gazing across the Channel at England, it wasn't just ambition driving him, it was the unshakable belief that a man who'd cheated death a dozen times could bend fate itself. 7 years old, that's how young William was when his father, Duke Robert, made a decision that would plunge Normandy into chaos, leaving for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and naming the boy as his heir. Picture a child barely old enough to wield a sword, suddenly handed the keys to one of Europe's most turbulent duchies. The nobles erupted. To them, this wasn't just a succession, it was an insult. A bastard ruling over men who traced their lineages back centuries, unthinkable. Within months, rebellion simmered. Guardians appointed to protect young William were murdered. Castles meant to shelter him became death traps. The boy Duke's survival hinged on a handful of loyalists who smuggled him between safe houses, often under cover of darkness. Yet here's what's astonishing: William didn't just endure, he learned. By his teens, he'd turned vulnerability into strategy. He watched as allies betrayed him, studied how rebels moved, and filed away every slight. When his great-uncle, Archbishop Robert, tried to seize control, William didn't flee. he outmaneuvered him, using church alliances to strip the man of power. By 15, he'd personally led troops to crush his first uprising, proving that the boy they'd underestimated could wield force as deftly as any seasoned warlord. But raw strength wasn't enough. Normandy was a patchwork of feuding barons, each with private armies, William's masterstroke exploiting their rivalries. He played factions against each other, offering pardons to defectors while making grim examples of those who resisted. After defeating rebels at Val's Dunes, he didn't just celebrate, he invited the survivors to swear new oaths, binding them to him not through fear alone, but through calculated mercy. It was a lesson in medieval realpolitik: crush your enemies, but let some live to spread the tale. By 20, he'd cemented his rule through sheer audacity. Take the siege of Alençon, when defenders hung animal hides over the walls to mock his mother's lowborn status. William didn't just retaliate, he made it legendary. After breaching the walls, he ordered 32 captives mutilated, their hands and feet severed. Brutal, absolutely. But in an age where reputation was currency, the message was unmistakable: insult him at your peril. What's often overlooked is how these early years forged the conqueror to come. Normandy's instability taught him to move fast, strike hard, and never rely on tradition. While other rulers inherited unquestioned loyalty, William clawed his way to authority, creating a blueprint he'd later use in England, where once again he'd face a kingdom convinced he didn't belong. The boy Duke's rise wasn't just luck, it was a preview of the iron will that would reshape history. The promise that would reshape England's destiny wasn't made on a battlefield or in some grand council. It allegedly happened during a quiet exile. In 1051, England's King Edward the Confessor, himself half Norman, found shelter in Normandy after Viking invasions and political upheaval forced him from his throne. For over 25 years, Edward lived among Norman nobles, absorbing their customs, their language, even their architecture. And during those formative years, he grew close to his young cousin William, then just a rising duke battling rebellions in his own land. Here's where history gets murky. Norman chroniclers insist Edward, still years away from reclaiming England's crown, swore an oath to name William his heir. No parchment survives to prove it, but the implications are staggering. If true, it meant England's throne wasn't just William's ambition, it was his birthright promised by a king. But Anglo-Saxon sources tell a different tale. The English court vehemently denied any such oath, claiming Edward later named Harold Godwinson, his brother-in-law and England's most powerful earl, as successor on his deathbed. The truth likely lies somewhere in the fog of medieval politics. Edward's promise, if it happened, wasn't some heartfelt vow, it was realpolitik. Exiled and desperate, he may have offered William the crown to secure Norman military support for his own return to power. And William, ever the opportunist, would have recognized the value of such a pledge, whether binding or not. What's fascinating is how he weaponized that ambiguity later. When Harold Godwinson took the throne after Edward's death in 1066, William didn't just protest, he unleashed a propaganda campaign, painting Harold as an oath-breaker who'd pledged loyalty to him during a mysterious visit to Normandy years earlier. That visit is its own rabbit hole. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold supposedly swore fealty to William over holy relics, an act so sacred in medieval Europe that breaking it damned one's soul. English accounts claim Harold was shipwrecked in Normandy, held captive, and forced to swear under duress. Either way, William treated it as gospel, even petitioning the Pope for support by framing his invasion as a holy crusade against a perjurer. The irony, Harold's own brother Tostig allied with Viking King Harald Hardrada against him, fracturing England's defences just as William's fleet set sail. What makes this promise so pivotal isn't just its role in justifying the Norman conquest, it reveals William's genius for turning words into weapons. While Harold prepared for Viking attacks in the north, William spent months meticulously building his case across Europe, ensuring that when he landed at Hastings, he wasn't seen as a foreign invader, but as a wronged king reclaiming what was sworn to him. The promise, real or invented, became the linchpin of a masterful narrative, one that still echoes in the very fabric of English history. The oath that fractured history wasn't sworn in some grand cathedral or royal court. It happened in a shadowy chamber atop a chest of sacred bones. Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful earl, found himself on Norman soil under circumstances still hotly debated. Was he shipwrecked and captured, as English chroniclers claim? Or had Edward the Confessor sent him to confirm William's succession, as Normans insisted? Whatever the truth, what followed would become one of the Middle Ages' most explosive betrayals. William didn't just ask for Harold's loyalty. He staged a ritual so binding it verged on theater. Under the pretense of friendship, he led Harold to a chapel where relics of martyrs lay concealed beneath an altar cloth. As Harold placed his hands on what he thought was simple wood, William yanked back the fabric, revealing saintly remains. The gasp in the room must have been audible. To swear an oath over relics wasn't just a promise, it was a pact with heaven itself. Break it, and you risked eternal damnation. Harold's exact words are lost to time, but Norman sources paint a vivid scene. William pressing a jeweled crown onto the altar, demanding Harold acknowledge his right to England's throne. Under duress or not, Harold complied, only to ride back to England and within months accept that very crown for himself when Edward died. The speed of his coronation suggests panic. He was crowned the day after Edward's burial, as if fearing William's shadow already loomed across the Channel. William's fury wasn't just political, it was apocalyptic. He dispatched envoys to Rome, brandishing accounts of Harold's perjury before Pope Alexander II. Holy relics weren't just symbols, they were medieval credit scores for the soul. By framing Harold as an oath-breaker, William transformed his invasion from a land grab into a divine reckoning. The Pope sent back a consecrated banner, effectively making the Norman landing at Hastings a crusade. Yet Harold's side of the story holds haunting plausibility. If he was coerced, medieval canon law would have invalidated the oath. Some accounts even claim William later admitted as much in private, chuckling that only a fool would expect a man to keep a vow made at sword point. But for William, the oath's power lay not in its legality but in its narrative. It gave him something more valuable than right, the appearance of righteousness. When Norman ships finally crashed onto English shores, their sails bore not just warriors but the weight of a broken promise, one that would echo for centuries. William didn't just raise an army, he waged a war of perception. While Harold braced for Viking raids in the north, William spent months crafting something far more potent than swords: legitimacy. His masterstroke, convincing the Vatican that God himself sanctioned his claim to England. This wasn't mere diplomacy, it was psychological warfare on a celestial scale. The key to his strategy lay in Harold's broken oath. To medieval Europe, swearing falsely over holy relics wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. William's envoys arrived in Rome with meticulous accounts of Harold's betrayal, painting the English king as a man who'd spat in the face of divine law. But here's what's often missed: the Pope didn't just rubber-stamp William's ambition. Alexander II, a reformer obsessed with cleansing the Church of corruption, saw an opportunity. By backing William, he could tighten Rome's grip on England's notoriously independent clergy. The blessing came with strings attached. Future Norman rulers would owe the papacy favors. The symbols sent back to Normandy were anything but subtle. A consecrated banner, its fabric woven with threads blessed by saints, transformed William's fleet into holy warriors. Even more striking was the papal ring, its gemstone carved with symbols of St. Peter, the very keys to heaven. These weren't just tokens, they were medieval propaganda gold. William had them displayed at every rally, ensuring his troops, and Europe's courts saw him not as an invader, but as God's avenger. Yet the real brilliance lay in how he used that blessing to undermine Harold. While the English king scrambled to defend his shores, Norman priests circulated rumors that the Pope had excommunicated Harold, damning his soul. Imagine the terror in English villages when word spread that resisting William meant defying heaven itself. Even Harold's own bishops hesitated, their loyalty torn between crown and cross. What historians still debate is whether the Pope's support was genuine or politically coerced. Some letters suggest William threatened to expose Rome's own scandals if denied. Others point to Lanfranc, William's cunning Italian advisor, who'd once been the Pope's teacher and knew exactly how to manipulate Vatican politics. Either way, the effect was seismic. When William's ships finally sailed, their sails bore not just the Norman cross, but the weight of divine mandate, a psychological weapon as sharp as any sword. The Channel's fickle winds became William's greatest enemy in the summer of 1066. His invasion fleet, 700 ships packed with thousands of armored knights, war horses, and siege weapons, sat stranded on Normandy's coast for 6 agonizing weeks. Day after day, the sails hung limp, the sea refusing to cooperate. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a military nightmare. Every stalled moment allowed Harold to strengthen England's defenses, and worse, whispers spread through William's camp that the weather itself was a sign of divine disapproval. But here's what most accounts miss. Those stranded weeks revealed William's genius for turning disaster into advantage. While his men grew restless, he launched a propaganda blitz. Daily rations were doubled, feasts held on the beach to prove his resources were limitless. He ordered craftsmen to rebuild ships damaged by sudden storms, not in secret but in plain view, a theatrical display of Norman resilience. When rumors reached England that his fleet had been destroyed by gales, William didn't correct them. Let Harold think the threat had passed, the real stroke of brilliance. His handling of the winds themselves, Norman priests staged public exorcisms to banish the demons, holding back the fleet. Soldiers were ordered to unearth relics from local churches and parade them along the shore as if challenging heaven to oppose their holy mission. It worked, morale soared. By the time the winds finally shifted in late September, William's army wasn't just ready to sail. They were convinced God had lifted the curse himself. History remembers the Norman landing as a swift strike, but those lost weeks nearly unraveled everything. Viking King Harold Hardrada invaded northern England in mid-September, forcing Harold to march his army north. Had William sailed earlier, he'd have faced England's full strength. Instead, his stranded fleet became an accidental masterstroke. Harold's forces were exhausted from crushing the Vikings at Stamford Bridge when word arrived that Norman sails had been sighted. The delay, born of frustration, gifted William the single advantage that would decide Hastings, an enemy already bleeding and breathless, the lesson etched into those storm-tossed weeks. William understood something deeper than tactics. He knew war is as much theater as combat. While lesser commanders might have seen the stalled winds as defeat, he weaponized the weight, turning idle time into psychological preparation. When his ships finally cut through the waves, they carried not just soldiers, but the unshakable belief that even the elements bowed to the conqueror's will. The sands of Pevensey Bay should have been stained crimson on that September morning in 1066, but instead they lay eerily empty as William's fleet scraped ashore. Every Norman knight gripping his sword knew the horror stories, how Saxon warriors traditionally ambushed invaders waist-deep in water, hacking them apart before they could form ranks. Yet not a single English defender stood on that windswept beach. The fortifications looming above them, built centuries earlier by the Romans, stood abandoned, their gates creaking open like an invitation. This wasn't just luck, it was a tactical miracle. Harold's army, fresh from annihilating the Vikings at Stamford Bridge up north, was still marching south when William landed. The Saxon king had gambled that autumn storms would delay the Normans, but in a twist of fate, those same winds that stranded William's fleet for weeks now gifted him an undefended coastline. The timing was so perfect, some chroniclers later claimed God himself parted the channel for the invaders. What's often overlooked is how William exploited this windfall. Those deserted Roman walls at Pevensey became his instant stronghold, a ready-made fortress with towers high enough to spot Saxon reinforcements miles away. His men didn't have to waste precious days digging ditches or raising palisades. They simply occupied history's leftovers. Even the old Roman road threading inland gave his troops a direct path toward Hastings, where the decisive battle would come. But here's the real masterstroke. William turned the silence into terror. Knowing Harold would hear of his landing within hours, he ordered his men to immediately begin pillaging nearby villages, not just for supplies but for spectacle. Smoke pillars rose across the countryside, visible for miles. Every burning farmhouse was a message. The Normans weren't hiding, weren't negotiating. They wanted Harold to find them, to rush into battle exhausted from his northern campaign. The abandoned beach became psychological warfare. As Saxon scouts crept close, they reported an unsettling sight. Norman priests chanting mass on conquered ground, warriors feasting on stolen Saxon livestock as if they'd already won. By the time Harold's battered army arrived, they weren't just facing invaders, they faced men who acted like destiny itself had cleared their path. The most famous death in English history might be a lie. For centuries, the Bayeux Tapestry's gruesome scene, Harold Godwinson clutching an arrow through his eye, has been gospel truth. But peel back the layers and the story unravels. Norman accounts written within years of Hastings never mention the arrow. Instead, they describe Harold hacked apart by William's knights, his body so mutilated that even his mistress couldn't identify it. So how did the arrow legend take hold? Look closer at the tapestry itself. That iconic Harold figure isn't even labeled. Some historians argue it shows a different Saxon warrior, while Harold actually perished moments later under a flurry of swords. The propaganda angle is undeniable. Medieval battles were won not just with steel but with symbolism. An arrow through the eye carried divine weight. It was seen as God's judgment for oath breakers. What better way to cement William's Holy Crusade narrative than to have his rival struck down by celestial wrath? Norman poets later spun elaborate tales of Harold's death throes, how he tore the arrow free only to be cut down moments later. These weren't neutral accounts, they were morality plays stitched into history. Yet alternative theories persist. One 12th century English chronicle claims Harold survived Hastings entirely, fleeing to live as a hermit. More plausibly, military experts note that Saxon shields formed an impenetrable wall against arrows, making an eye shot statistically unlikely unless Harold lifted his visor at the worst possible moment. The grim truth may lie in battlefield archaeology. Mass graves near Hastings reveal corpses with devastating leg and torso wounds, suggesting the final struggle was a close-quarter massacre, not an archer's lucky strike. What's rarely discussed is how Harold's disputed death served both sides. For Normans, the arrow was divine retribution. For Saxons, the mutilation story fueled martyrdom, their king fighting to his last breath against impossible odds. Even the tapestry hedges its bets. The next panel shows a Norman knight cutting down an unarmed man near the same spot. 2 deaths for one king, or deliberate ambiguity to let viewers see what they wanted. The real shock isn't that we don't know how Harold died. It's that William's spin doctors crafted a version so compelling, we're still debating it a millennium later. Westminster Abbey should have been a scene of triumph, golden light filtering through stained glass, Latin chants rising toward the vaulted ceilings as England's new king knelt for his crown. Instead, the air reeked of smoke and panic. As the archbishop placed the royal diadem on William's head, Norman soldiers stationed outside misheard the thunderous Saxon shouts of acclamation as the beginnings of a rebellion. Sword hilts clenched, they torched nearby houses, sending flames licking at the abbey's very walls. Within moments, the sacred ceremony devolved into chaos. nobles trampling each other to escape, the coronation cloth nearly catching fire, and William himself left trembling, not with joy but raw terror as the first act of his reign. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The Normans and Saxons didn't just speak different languages, they had opposing customs. To Norman ears, the guttural shouts of "God save the King" in Old English sounded like war cries. Even the abbey's acoustics played a role. Its stone walls amplified echoes, distorting voices into something ominous. But the deeper tension was palpable. William had just spent months slaughtering Saxon resistance. His coronation date, Christmas Day 1066, was no accident. He aimed to cloak his rule in divine symbolism, yet the flames outside betrayed the truth. Conquest and holiness made uneasy bedfellows. What's often overlooked is how William turned this fiasco into a psychological weapon. As the crowd fled, he alone remained at the altar, refusing to flinch while the roof beams crackled overhead. That image, a king unshaken amid chaos, became legend. Later chroniclers spun the fires as divine purification, a literal baptism by flame for England's new era. The scorch marks on the abbey stones, not scars but proof of God testing his chosen ruler. Yet the Saxon perspective reveals a darker irony. The buildings set ablaze weren't random, they housed the very families who'd surrendered to William weeks earlier. Their reward for submission, homelessness in midwinter. Some scholars argue the misunderstanding was deliberate, a show of force disguised as accident. Whether calculated or not, the message was clear. Even on his holiest day, the Conqueror's peace hung by a thread. The coronation chaos foreshadowed William's entire reign, a mix of pageantry and brutality, where every sacred ritual crackled with the tension of a kingdom held by the sword. And when the final hymn faded that day, the abbey's floor wasn't strewn with flowers, but with trampled relics and the footprints of fleeing men. A fitting start for a ruler who'd spend the next 20 years extinguishing fires, both real and metaphorical, across his fractured realm. The winter of 1069 wasn't just cold, it was apocalyptic. While most medieval kings faced rebellions, William confronted something far more dangerous. A full-scale uprising backed by Viking fleets and Saxon earls who refused to accept Norman rule. His response would become one of the darkest chapters in English history, a campaign so brutal, chroniclers ran out of words to describe the horror. They called it the harrying of the North, but harrowing would have been more accurate, a systematic scorching of earth and soul that left entire regions lifeless for generations. This wasn't standard medieval warfare. When rebellions flared across Yorkshire and Durham, William didn't just defeat his enemies, he erased their world. Villages vanished in pillars of smoke, crops were torched in the fields, livestock slaughtered, their carcasses left to rot in poisoned wells. The tactics were chillingly precise. Soldiers fanned out across the countryside with orders to leave nothing, not a barn, not a millstone, not a single sheaf of grain. Starvation became his weapon. Contemporary accounts describe parents eating their own children, roads littered with corpses gnawed by wolves, survivors selling themselves into slavery for a mouthful of bread. What's often overlooked is the calculated cruelty behind the chaos. William didn't just punish rebels, he made certain no one would ever dare rise again. Records from the Domesday Book, compiled years later, still showed vast tracts labeled waste, their populations never recovering. Some estimates suggest 100,000 perished, a staggering number for the era. Even the Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis, usually loyal to William, wrote with trembling quill, "I am more inclined to weep for the multitudes who suffered than to waste my words on the vanity of royal glory." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Refugees fleeing south carried stories so ghastly they silenced potential uprisings elsewhere. One particularly macabre detail survives. Norman soldiers reportedly strung corpses from trees along major roads, a grisly welcome sign for any would-be rebels. Yet the most haunting legacy lies in the earth itself. Archaeologists still find layers of ash in northern soil from that terrible winter, a geological scar of William's wrath. Was it genocide by modern standards? Unquestionably, but in William's mind this was grim necessity. He'd spent years putting down piecemeal revolts only to see them reignite like phoenixes. The North's vast, rugged terrain made traditional occupation impossible. His solution: make the land itself his ally. No crops meant no rebels could hide in the hills. No villages meant no shelters for Viking allies. The message was carved into the charred bones of the landscape. Resistance equaled annihilation. Yet even in this darkness there's a twisted pragmatism. After the carnage, William funneled survivors into newly built castles, his own version of medieval shock therapy, breaking ancient Saxon loyalties by force. He allowed the few remaining northern nobles to keep their titles, but only after they knelt barefoot in the snow, swearing oaths over relics at York Minster. It was the ultimate paradox of his reign. The man who ravaged England also rebuilt it in his image, ensuring that while the North never forgot his cruelty, it would ultimately submit to his vision of order. The harrying didn't just crush a rebellion, it rewrote the rules of power, proving that in William's England, mercy was a luxury few could afford. The Domesday Book wasn't just a census, it was a weapon disguised as parchment. In 1086, 20 years after Hastings, William ordered a survey so thorough, so invasive, that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called it Doomsday, believing nothing short of the apocalypse could justify such scrutiny. Imagine teams of Norman officials descending on every village, demanding to know not just who owned the land, but how many pigs grazed in the woods, how many fish swam in the ponds, even how many cooking pots hung in each household. For a population still reeling from conquest, this wasn't bureaucracy. It was a nightmare made real. The real shock lay in the questions themselves. Unlike modern censuses focused on population, the Domesday Book fixated on wealth, specifically how much more William could squeeze from his subjects. Officials asked whether land had been wasted during the harrying of the North, not out of remorse but to calculate its taxable potential. They probed disputes between Saxon peasants and Norman lords, not to render justice, but to identify who owed what to the crown. Every answer was cross-referenced with local juries under oath, creating a system so airtight that evasion became impossible. What's often glossed over is the psychological terror behind this survey. Saxon villagers, many illiterate, watched as strangers inscribed their livelihoods onto pages that would never be shown to them. The very name Domesday reflected their dread. Like Judgment Day, these records were final, unappealable, their details locked into royal vaults. For Normans, it was a triumph of organization. For Saxons, proof that even their chicken coops now belonged to the Conqueror's ledger. Yet the darkest genius lay in how William used the data. The book revealed hidden assets, forests secretly farmed, mills tucked away in valleys, all now taxable. It exposed Anglo-Saxon nobles who downplayed their wealth, leading to sudden confiscations. Most chillingly, it created a blueprint for systematic exploitation. Want to raise an army? The Domesday Book listed every knight's fee owed by landowners. Need to crush a rebellion? It identified which regions had surplus grain to feed troops. Modern historians often frame the Domesday Book as a medieval marvel, the first great public record. But in its time, it was something far more sinister. A ledger written in the ink of conquest, every line a reminder that resistance was not just futile, it was quantifiable. When William's tax collectors arrived with their parchments, they didn't just bring quills. They brought the unshakable certainty that no cow, no acre, no life in England could hide from the crown's grasp. William's crown came with a constant shadow, the gnawing certainty that at any moment daggers might flash in the dark. After surviving at least a dozen assassination attempts before even turning 20, the Conqueror developed habits that would seem paranoid in anyone else. He never slept in the same chamber twice in a row, rotating between hidden rooms in his castles, some accessible only by removable ladders. Servants sworn to secrecy laid fresh straw for his bedding in undisclosed locations each night, while guards deliberately spread false rumors about his whereabouts. Even trusted advisors often had no idea where the king would rest until the last moment. The most visible monument to this obsession still looms over London, the White Tower, the original core of what we now call the Tower of London. William didn't build it as a royal residence but as a psychological weapon. Its 90-foot walls, hewn from imported keen stone, gleamed intimidatingly white, a visible assertion of Norman power. But the real genius lay in its design. The main entrance was on the second floor, reachable only by a wooden staircase that could be torched at the first sign of rebellion. Inside, spiral staircases twisted clockwise, forcing attackers to wield swords awkwardly with their left hands while defenders above had full range of motion. Even the chapel was placed above storerooms, ensuring anyone storming the building would have to fight through supplies and garrison quarters before reaching holy ground where the king might take refuge. This wasn't just architecture, it was trauma crystallized in stone. William's nightmares weren't abstract, they were memories. He'd witnessed guardians murdered in their sleep as a child, seen allies succumb to poisoned wine, and once escaped an ambush by hiding in a beggar's hovel while his decoy was butchered. By the time he conquered England, his precautions bordered on ritual. Food tasters sampled every dish not once, but 3 times before he would eat. Armorers intentionally weakened the rivets on his subordinates' mail, ensuring only William's own gear could withstand full combat. The irony, his greatest fortress became his greatest vulnerability. In his final years, crippled by obesity and pain, William reportedly hid within the White Tower's depths, tormented by rumors that his own sons plotted against him. The man who'd built an empire through sheer force of will now barricaded himself behind walls meant to keep death out, only to find it had been inside him all along, in the form of a riding injury that would slowly kill him. The tower stood impregnable, yet the king within was already crumbling. William's marriage to Matilda of Flanders wasn't just a political alliance, it was a scandal that nearly cost him the church's favor. The Pope himself declared their union forbidden, citing consanguinity. The two were distant cousins, a common enough issue in medieval nobility, but one that suddenly became urgent when it served political interests. Rumors swirled that Matilda had initially refused William's proposal, mocking his illegitimate birth until an enraged duke rode to Flanders, dragged her from horseback by her braids, and threw her into the street. Whether true or not, the story reveals how much this marriage defied expectations from the start. The physical contrast between them couldn't have been more striking. William towered over his contemporaries at around 5 feet 10 inches, a giant for the era, while Matilda stood a mere 4 feet 2, small enough that her sarcophagus would later be mistaken for a child's. Yet her stature belied a formidable intellect and political savvy. As Duchess, she ruled Normandy in William's absence with such efficiency that rebels feared her as much as her husband. She commissioned ships for his invasion fleet using her own funds, and her diplomatic ties to Flanders provided crucial alliances. The irony, the very consanguinity that once threatened their marriage became their shield when the Pope finally lifted the ban after years of negotiation. It was because Matilda had financed the construction of 2 abbeys as penance, a masterstroke that turned excommunication into absolution. Their partnership defied every convention. While most noblewomen faded into the background, Matilda accompanied William to England after Hastings, becoming the first crowned queen consort in decades. She bore him 9 children who survived infancy, an extraordinary number for the time, cementing the dynasty's future. Behind the scenes, their letters hint at a rare medieval love match. William, who trusted almost no one, relied on her counsel openly, even issuing joint charters that named her as co-ruler. When she died in 1083, the famously ruthless conqueror plunged into grief so deep that chroniclers noted he gave up every joyful thing for months. The greatest testament to their bond lies in the Bayeux tapestry itself, likely commissioned by Matilda. Amid scenes of war and conquest, one panel stands out, a shadowy female figure, small but central, watching as the fleet sails for England. Some scholars believe this is Matilda, woven into history as both witness and architect of her husband's destiny. Their marriage, once forbidden by holy decree, became the bedrock of Norman rule, proving that in William's world, even the Pope's word could be bent to the will of a duke and his diminutive, indomitable queen. The apple didn't just fall far from the tree, it rolled downhill, gathered speed, and nearly smashed William's legacy to pieces. Robert Curthose, his eldest son, was everything the Conqueror despised. Reckless where his father was calculating, generous with rebels when William demanded iron-fisted discipline, and worst of all, convinced he deserved Normandy before his father was ready to relinquish it. Their feud wasn't just a family squabble, it was a clash of dynastic survival, one that would leave William bleeding on a battlefield, staring up at the son who'd just tried to kill him. The trouble started with a promise and a nickname. Curthose meant short boots, a jab at Robert's fashionable, impractical footwear, but it might as well have described his patience. Though William had designated him heir to Normandy, the young prince chafed under his father's control. While William saw loyalty as non-negotiable, Robert surrounded himself with disgruntled nobles and even befriended exiled Saxon lords, men his father had spent decades crushing. The breaking point came when William, still very much alive and ruling, refused to hand over full ducal powers. Robert's response: he fled to Flanders in 1077 and began raising an army against his own father. The rebellion that followed reads like a medieval tragedy. At the siege of Gerberoi in 1079, Robert led a charge so ferocious he didn't realize he'd unhorsed and wounded William until he heard the conqueror's voice cursing him from the ground. The moment of recognition must have been paralyzing. Father and son locked in combat, the very foundation of Norman power crumbling beneath them. William survived only because a quick-thinking knight shouted a distraction, giving him time to retreat. Even then, the wound ran deeper than flesh. For a man who'd spent his life forging unity through force, betrayal by his own blood was an existential threat. What's often overlooked is how this strife mirrored William's own youth, except this time he was the authority figure being challenged. His response was brutally pragmatic. After a temporary reconciliation brokered by Queen Matilda, Robert went rogue again, this time allying with France's king against his father. William's retaliation was legendary. He besieged Robert's stronghold at Rouen until starvation forced surrender, then imposed terms so humiliating, one chronicler claimed Robert was made to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside his father's tent before being granted an audience. The bitter irony: Robert's rebellions exposed the flaw in William's life's work. He'd built an empire on the principle that might made right only to find his son wielding that same logic against him. Even on his deathbed in 1087, William couldn't bring himself to fully forgive Robert, leaving him Normandy but pointedly denying him England, which went to younger brother William Rufus. The message was clear: the conqueror's legacy would be divided rather than entrusted to a son who'd learned his lessons too well. Yet history has a sly sense of justice. Robert would eventually rule Normandy ineptly, losing lands to his brothers before meeting his own humiliating end, imprisoned for nearly 30 years. His story isn't just a footnote, it's a dark mirror of William's reign, proof that the very ruthlessness that forged an empire could also unravel it from within. The father who'd risen from bastard to conqueror watched helplessly as his heir squandered that legacy, not through weakness, but through the same unbridled ambition that had built it. Odo of Bayeux wasn't just William's half-brother, he was a living contradiction, a bishop who wielded a mace instead of a cross and whose ambition burned brighter than any cathedral candle. After helping William secure England, he'd grown too powerful too fast. By 1082, Odo controlled vast lands in both Normandy and England, flaunting wealth that rivaled the king's. When rumors spread that he was plotting to buy the papacy for himself, William acted with characteristic ruthlessness. He arrested Odo at a royal council, dragging him from the hall by his vestments while the bishop screamed curses in Latin. What followed was a prison sentence that lasted 5 long years until the Conqueror, on his deathbed, inexplicably ordered Odo's release. Within months, the bishop was dead under circumstances so strange, even medieval chroniclers whispered of foul play. The timing alone raises eyebrows. Odo emerged from captivity in 1087, just as William lay dying from a riding injury in Rouen. Some accounts claim the king had a last-minute change of heart, pardoning his brother in a fit of remorse. Others suggest Odo's allies bribed guards to secure his freedom the moment William fell ill. But here's where the story twists. Instead of rushing to his brother's deathbed, Odo fled to Normandy, gathering an army within weeks. His goal, seizing the English crown from William's chosen heir, William Rufus. It was an act of staggering audacity or desperation. Then came the sudden end. In early 1088, while preparing to cross the Channel with his forces, Odo collapsed during a feast in Rouen. Contemporary accounts describe him clutching his throat after drinking wine, his face turning black as soot before he suffocated. Poison was the obvious suspect, but by whom? Rufus had motive, yet no evidence links him directly. Some pointed to Robert Curthose, William's rebellious eldest son, who saw Odo as a rival for power. Even more intriguing is the theory that William himself arranged the poisoning before his death, leaving orders with loyalists to eliminate his brother if he ever threatened the succession. The aftermath only deepens the mystery. Odo's vast estates were swiftly divided among William's sons, his name scrubbed from official records. The Bayeux Tapestry, which he likely commissioned, conspicuously omits any mention of his later betrayal. Most telling of all, his body was buried not in the grand cathedral he'd built but in an unmarked grave, a final indignity for a man who'd once dreamed of wearing the papal tiara. Whether by poison or divine judgment, Odo's fate serves as a dark coda to William's reign. Even blood couldn't protect you from the Conqueror's shadow. William the Conqueror's alleged illiteracy is one of history's most persistent myths, but scratch beneath the surface, and the evidence paints a far more nuanced picture. While it's true he never penned flowery letters like some medieval scholars, dismissing him as uneducated ignores a crucial reality. This was a man who navigated papal politics, interpreted complex legal charters, and almost certainly understood Latin, the language of power and piety. Consider the Bayeux Tapestry itself, a 70-meter-long masterpiece of visual storytelling so sophisticated in its symbolism, so precise in its messaging, that its creation would have required direct input from someone deeply literate in both scripture and statecraft. That someone was almost certainly William. The myth of his illiteracy likely stems from Norman chroniclers who exaggerated his rough edges to fit the warrior king archetype. But here's what contemporary accounts reveal. As Duke, he routinely presided over church councils where theological Latin filled the air. His closest advisors, like Lanfranc of Bec, were among Europe's most learned scholars, and it's inconceivable he couldn't at least comprehend their discussions. Even more telling, the Domesday Book, a project demanding meticulous literacy. William didn't just order its creation, he dictated its structure, insisting on data so granular that illiteracy would have made oversight impossible. Then there's the tapestry's hidden literacy test. Its Latin inscriptions aren't just labels, they're layered with wordplay only a Latin reader would grasp. Take Harold's infamous oath scene. The text emphasizes sacramentum, a term loaded with ecclesiastical weight, suggesting the artist, or more likely, the patron, understood how to weaponize language. Even the tapestry's margins whisper literacy. Strange creatures clutch scrolls with garbled Latin, a visual joke poking fun at those who couldn't read. The message: this wasn't art for the masses, it was propaganda for the elite, crafted by or for someone who moved effortlessly between sword and scripture. William's true skill lay in strategic literacy. He didn't need to write sonnets, he needed to decode treaties, spot loopholes in oaths, and commission works that would shape history. When he marked charters with a cross, it wasn't proof of ignorance but a deliberate royal gesture, much like modern leaders signing documents without reading every line. The irony: the very tapestry used to paint him as a brute warlord may be the clearest evidence of his hidden sophistication, a visual epic designed by a mind that knew exactly how words and images could conquer memory itself. The Bayeux Tapestry isn't just a chronicle of conquest, it's a medieval puzzle box stitched with symbols so loaded they practically hum with hidden meaning. Take that fiery streak across the sky, Halley's Comet, depicted blazing ominously above Harold's coronation. To modern eyes, it might look like decorative astronomy, but to an 11th century viewer, this was celestial screaming. Comets were universally feared as harbingers of doom, and its placement here is no accident. Just as Harold takes the crown, the heavens themselves seem to recoil, a divine billboard announcing his reign is cursed before it even begins. This wasn't subtlety, it was Norman propaganda woven in wool and linen. But the tapestry's secrets run deeper than a single ominous streak. Look closely at the borders framing the main scenes. Among the whimsical beasts and farming vignettes lurks something darker, a fable about a wolf and a crane, where the bird helps remove a bone from the wolf's throat only to be rewarded with a snapped beak. The moral: ingratitude, a not-so-subtle dig at Harold, who in Norman eyes owed his earldom to William's support before allegedly betraying him. Even the animals tell the story William wanted remembered. Then there's what's conspicuously missing. The tapestry skips straight from Harold's oath over relics to Edward the Confessor's deathbed, glossing over the messy months when Harold might have had legitimate claim to the throne. And where's Edgar Atheling, Edward's great-nephew and blood heir, whose existence undermines William's rightful successor narrative? His absence screams deliberate censorship. Some historians argue entire panels were removed, possibly showing Harold's coronation with full ceremonial legitimacy, scenes too dangerous to survive Norman revisionism. Most tantalizing is the mystery of the tapestry's final panels, now lost to time. The existing ending, a triumphant William at Hastings, almost certainly wasn't the original conclusion. Fragments from medieval inventories suggest there were once scenes of William's coronation, possibly even his notorious harrying of the north. Were these removed to soften his image for later generations, or did they depict something even more controversial, like his strained relationship with the church? What remains is a masterpiece of selective storytelling, where every stitch serves a purpose and every omission speaks as loud as the threads left in place. Decoding the tapestry isn't just about spotting symbols, it's about recognizing whose voices were silenced in the retelling. The official history it presents is as strategically curated as a modern campaign ad, proving that even 9 centuries ago, the victors didn't just write history, they embroidered it. William didn't just conquer England, he revolutionized medieval warfare with tactics so audacious, they blurred the line between genius and outright cheating. While most commanders relied on brute force, William treated war like a chess game, introducing innovations that left his enemies baffled and outmaneuvered. Take his castles. Instead of spending months building stone fortresses, he pioneered prefabricated wooden forts dismantled into pieces, shipped across the channel, and reassembled in hours. These weren't just shelters, they were psychological weapons. Imagine Saxon rebels watching in horror as Norman carpenters erected towering strongholds where empty fields had stood at dawn, each new fortress a chokehold on the landscape. Then there were the crossbows, a weapon so destructive the church later tried to ban it. Unlike traditional bows, crossbows could punch through chainmail at 200 paces, requiring minimal training to wield. Saxon chroniclers raged that this wasn't warfare, it was murder by mechanics, allowing low-born soldiers to kill nobles with the pull of a trigger. William didn't care about chivalric complaints. He stocked his armies with mercenary crossbowmen from Italy, their weapons' eerie twang sending panic through enemy ranks long before swords clashed. But his most underrated tactic, psychological timing. At Hastings he ordered feigned retreats, a maneuver so risky most medieval generals avoided it. When Saxon shields broke ranks to chase fleeing Normans, William's cavalry wheeled around and butchered them. The brilliance lay in repetition. After the third fake retreat, the Saxons stopped believing in real ones, dooming them when William's forces finally regrouped for the killing blow. This wasn't just strategy, it was behavioral warfare, exploiting human impulse like a puppeteer. What truly set William apart was his willingness to borrow from enemies. After encountering Danish-style shield walls in early skirmishes, he adapted them for Norman troops, layering Saxon defensive tactics with Norman cavalry charges. Even his supply chains were revolutionary. While others pillaged the countryside, William's fleet kept his army fed via secured ports, ensuring his soldiers fought hungry opponents. The lesson: the Conqueror didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules, proving that in war, innovation was the deadliest weapon of all. Harold Godwinson's corpse became a battleground even in death, a puzzle wrapped in gore and propaganda. The Bayeux Tapestry's final scenes show his body surrounded by Norman knights, but the grim details of his burial were scrubbed from official records. Fragments of truth survive in hushed chronicles and local legends, that his mutilated remains missing a leg, face slashed beyond recognition, were denied Christian burial by William's orders, left to rot on the battlefield as a warning. Yet the most haunting version comes from a 12th century poem, the Carmen de Hastingi Prolio, which claims Harold's lover, Edith Swan Neck, crept onto the blood-soaked field at night to identify him. Not by his face or armor, but by secret marks only a lover would know: scars, birthmarks, perhaps even tattoos hidden beneath his clothing. The political theater of this moment can't be overstated. William had every reason to obscure Harold's grave. A martyr's tomb could rally Saxon resistance, transforming defeat into a rallying cry. But Edith's whispered identification hints at a darker possibility, that Harold's body was deliberately disfigured to prevent sainthood. Medieval cults often formed around relics of slain kings, especially those who died violently. By denying Harold's followers a clear corpse or burial site, William wasn't just punishing a rival, he was erasing a potential saint. Yet folklore refuses to let Harold stay buried. At least 5 English churches claim to hold his bones, each with competing legends. Waltham Abbey insists he was quietly interred there under a stone marked only "In Felix," Latin for unhappy. Another tale says his remains were moved to a secret grave after William's men exhumed and desecrated them. The wildest version, that Edith smuggled his body to a Saxon hermitage, where monks preserved his heart in a lead casket, still beating through dark magic. What makes these stories more than macabre gossip is their resonance with medieval anxieties about power and sacrilege. A king denied proper burial was a cosmic disruption, a soul trapped between worlds. William's alleged mutilation of Harold's corpse, whether true or not, became proof of his ruthlessness, a tale Saxons told to explain the famine and plague that followed the conquest. Even the intimate Mark's story serves dual purposes. It humanizes Harold as a man who loved and was loved, while framing William as so monstrous he drove women to grope through corpses at midnight. The ultimate irony: in trying to erase Harold, William immortalized him. The very ambiguity surrounding his burial created space for myth to flourish, turning a defeated king into a ghost that haunted Norman rule for generations. Every whispered tale of Edith's devotion, every contested grave, was a quiet rebellion against the Conqueror's version of history. Harold's body might have been lost, but his legend, stitched together from scars and secrets, proved impossible to bury. The man who once led cavalry charges with the agility of a wolf spent his final years trapped in a body that had become his own prison. By the 1080s, the warrior who'd scaled castle walls in full armor could barely mount a horse without assistance, his frame swollen to grotesque proportions. Chroniclers of the time, usually hesitant to criticize kings outright, couldn't resist cruel jabs, or Derek Vitalis described him as corpulent to the point of deformity, while others compared his silhouette to a great barrel draped in silk. This wasn't just normal aging. Medieval accounts suggest William exceeded 300 pounds, a staggering size for an era when famine haunted commoners. What makes this physical transformation so startling is the stark contrast with his early years. The young William had been famed for his endurance, able to march for days on minimal rations and sleep fully armored in the saddle. His horsemanship was legendary. The Bayeux Tapestry shows him lifting his visor mid-battle to prove he still lived, a feat requiring tremendous core strength. But the roots of his obesity reveal deeper truths about the toll of conquest. Years of battlefield injuries left him with chronic pain, especially from a shattered kneecap during the siege of Alençon. Unable to exercise, he turned to food with the same intensity he'd once directed toward warfare. Courtiers whispered that he consumed enough for 3 men at a single sitting, his feast lasting well past midnight. The psychological dimension cuts even deeper. Medieval kings were expected to embody martial vigor, their bodies living symbols of divine favor. William's girth became a political liability, fueling rumors that God had abandoned him. Rebel lords joked that Normandy now had 2 dukes, William and his belly. Even his armor had to be altered repeatedly, the once proud suit of mail transformed into a humiliating corset of steel. The cruelest twist, his weight likely contributed to the riding accident that killed him. When his warhorse startled and threw him against his saddle pommel in 1087, the force of his massive body crushing inward ruptured internal organs. But there's haunting symbolism in this physical decline. The man who'd spent a lifetime conquering found himself conquered by his own appetites. His final portrait in the Historia Ecclesiastica shows him weeping as he divides his lands, his bulk making it impossible to stand without support. A far cry from the golden-haired youth who'd once galloped across Normandy, daring death with every leap. In the end, William's body became a cautionary tale written in flesh. Even the mightiest warrior could be brought low by the quiet enemy within. The fire at Mantes wasn't just a military tactic, it was the spark that would extinguish the conqueror's life. In the summer of 1087, an aging William, already racked by fever and barely able to sit a horse, ordered his troops to torch the rebellious town southwest of Paris. The act itself was routine for a man who'd spent decades crushing dissent, but this time fate intervened with cruel precision. As flames consumed the thatched roofs, William's warhorse, spooked by embers or perhaps the screams of townsfolk, reared violently. The king's massive frame, now swollen to over 300 pounds, slammed down onto the saddle pommel with such force that his intestines ruptured. The pain was instant, catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe a scene both tragic and grotesque. William, who'd once led charges with the agility of a panther, now writhed on the ground, his face draining of color as internal bleeding poisoned his body. What makes this moment so haunting isn't just the irony, a warlord felled by his own incendiary tactics, but the denial that followed. Refusing to acknowledge the severity of his injury, William insisted on being carried back to Rouen in a litter, where he spent weeks dictating letters and wills while his organs slowly necrotized. The man who'd built an empire through sheer force of will couldn't accept that his body had finally betrayed him. The deeper tragedy lay in the campaign's futility. Mantes was a minor flare-up in a border dispute with France's king. Philip I, a skirmish beneath the notice of a ruler who'd faced Viking warlords and Saxon rebellions. Some historians suggest William took the field personally not out of necessity, but because his son's incompetence forced him back into armor. Robert Curthose had already proven himself a reckless disappointment in Normandy. Younger sons William Rufus and Henry hovered like vultures over the succession. The Conqueror's final ride may have been less about strategy than pride, a desperate attempt to prove he was still the indomitable force who'd crossed the Channel 21 years earlier. Even the injury itself became a metaphor for his reign. That fatal collision with the saddle pommel, the very symbol of knightly power, mirrored how the tools he'd wielded so ruthlessly now turned against him. The fire he set at Mantes, meant to intimidate, became his funeral pyre in all but name. As infection set in, his courtiers watched helplessly while the king who'd once terrified Europe dwindled into a feverish shadow, bargaining with priests and griping about ungrateful heirs. His last coherent act, ordering the release of political prisoners, including his treacherous half-brother Odo, not out of mercy, but because dying with their blood on his conscience might jeopardize his soul's passage to heaven. The true measure of William's end lies in what it revealed. For all his conquests, he died fearing divine judgment, haunted by the thousands who'd perished in his name. The intestines ruptured at Mantes weren't just a physical wound, they were the bursting of a life built on relentless pressure, leaving behind a kingdom as fractured as the body that forged it. Even in death, he couldn't escape the chaos he'd created, his final hours punctuated by servants looting the chamber and his corpse abandoned on the floor as nobles raced to secure their futures. The fire at Mantes didn't just kill a king, it exposed the fragile humanity behind the legend, proving that no amount of conquered land could shield even history's most formidable figures from the consequences of time and triumph alike. William's funeral was meant to be a grand display of Norman power. Instead, it became a grotesque spectacle of unraveling dignity. When the Conqueror finally succumbed to his injuries in September 1087, his body should have been prepared for a stately procession to his chosen resting place at the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Keene. But Normandy's sweltering summer heat had other plans. By the time embalmers reached his bloated corpse, decomposition had already set in, twisting his features into a mask no amount of spices or perfumed shrouds could disguise. Those who witnessed the preparation swore the body had turned black, the skin splitting as workers tried and failed to force it into a stone sarcophagus meant for a slimmer man. The real horror came during the funeral mass itself. As monks chanted prayers for the dead, the pressure of trapped gases proved too much for William's distended abdomen. With a sound described by one eyewitness as like a slaughtered ox bursting its skin, the corpse ruptured, spewing putrid fluids across the church floor. The stench was so overwhelming, mourners, including knights who'd faced Saxon axes without flinching, vomited in the aisles or fled gagging into the courtyard. Even the bishop, tasked with conducting the service, reportedly cut the ceremony short, his voice muffled by a cloth pressed to his face. Ironically, this macabre scene mirrored the contradictions of William's reign. The man who demanded absolute order in life couldn't control the chaos of his own decay. The stone sarcophagus, carved years earlier when he was still vigorous, now stood as a cruel joke too narrow for the swollen king who'd outgrown even his mortality. When attendants finally crammed the remains inside, they used such force that the corpse's spine audibly snapped, a final indignity for the warrior who'd once straightened England's laws with iron resolve. Yet the funeral's disasters didn't end there. As the tomb was sealed, a local man named Asselin suddenly pushed through the crowd, shouting that the land beneath the abbey had been stolen from his family by William decades earlier. In a surreal moment of posthumous reckoning, the clergy had to pause the burial while compensating Asselin with cash and additional lands on the spot, proof that even in death, the Conqueror's legacy was shadowed by grievances. What makes this grim episode more than just medieval tabloid fodder is how it resonated symbolically. For Normans, the bursting corpse became an omen of coming strife. William's sons would soon fracture his empire in a bitter war of succession. For Saxons, it was divine retribution, a flesh and blood metaphor for how arrogance inevitably rots from within. Even the abbey itself seemed to reject its founder. When the tomb was opened centuries later during religious wars, workers found the bones scattered and the lead coffin melted down for bullets, as if history itself couldn't decide whether to venerate William or erase him. The funeral that began as a solemn farewell instead became the perfect coda to a life of conquest and contradiction. Too large for his tomb, too brutal for sainthood, too consequential to be forgotten, no matter how badly anyone wanted to hold their nose and look away. William's bones couldn't even rest in peace. The tomb at Keen's Abbey of St. Etienne, meant to eternalize the Conqueror's legacy, became a revolving door for desecration. The first violation came barely a century after his death. Chroniclers recorded that in 1206, a fire ravaged the abbey, cracking open the stone sarcophagus and exposing the remains to looters who tore off pieces of his burial shroud as morbid souvenirs. But the real devastation arrived 6 centuries later, when the French Revolution's anti-monarchy frenzy reached Normandy in 1793. A mob stormed the abbey, smashing the tomb with sledgehammers and flinging William's bones into the street like common rubble. Witnesses described children kicking the skull between them like a ball, while others pocketed finger bones as macabre trophies. What's left today tells a haunting story of fragmentation. During 1987's excavation of the abbey ruins, archaeologists found only a single femur, authenticated as William's through modern testing, lying abandoned in a storage box of unrelated artifacts. The thigh bone's survival is its own mystery. Some claim a quick-thinking monk rescued it during the Revolution, hiding it inside a church wall. Others whisper it was sold and re-sold on the black market before finally returning to Keene. Even now, that lone bone sits in a modest display case, a far cry from the golden shrine William envisioned. The irony is almost poetic. The man who spent his life consolidating power now exists in pieces, his skeleton scattered across unknown locations, possibly ground into fertilizer or melted down for soap during the Revolution's industrial recycling of human remains. The thigh bone's thickness hints at his legendary physique, but its isolation underscores how thoroughly time unmade him. Even the remaining fragment nearly vanished again in 2023 when vandals attempted to steal it during a nighttime break-in, proof that 9 centuries later, William still can't escape the chaos he once commanded. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the abbey's current memorial. The original tomb slab, preserved despite the destruction, bears a 19th century inscription added when historians tried to reassemble the grave. Hic sepultus est invictissimus Guilielmus conquestor. Here lies the unconquered William the Conqueror. It's a line heavy with unintentional irony. The stone marks nothing but empty space, a monument to absence, just as William's legacy endures more in fragments of bone, of law, of language, than in any intact whole. The conqueror who reshaped England now exists in the negative space between what was stolen, what was lost, and what stubbornly remains. The empire William built with blood and fire began crumbling before his corpse was cold. His sons, raised on stories of their father's ruthless conquests, turned those same lessons against each other in a vicious 3-way war for supremacy. The youngest, Henry, snatched the English crown from his dying father's grasp, allegedly sprinting straight from William's death chamber to seize the royal treasury while his brothers bickered. Middle brother William Rufus ruled England with such greed and cruelty. His own court whispered he'd made a demonic pact until a mysteriously well-aimed arrow felled him during a hunt, leaving Henry to scoop up both England and Normandy. But the eldest, Robert Curthose, proved most tragically inept, losing Normandy to Henry after squandering his inheritance on failed crusades and hollow boasts. Within decades, the conqueror's hard-won Anglo-Norman realm had fractured like poorly tempered steel. Yet William's ghost refused to stay buried. 2 centuries later, Richard the Lionheart would still invoke the Conqueror's name like a sacred incantation when defending his own contested throne. During his captivity in Germany, Richard's allies circulated a letter claiming descent from William, who by right and by sword made England his own, a none too subtle reminder that legitimacy could be hacked from history with sufficient force. Even King John, for all his failures, leaned heavily on the myth of their invincible ancestor when facing rebellious barons. The irony: these Plantagenet kings clung to William's legacy while dismantling his very system of absolute rule. Richard drained England's coffers for crusades. John signed Magna Carta under duress, proving that even dynasties built on conquest must eventually bend. The true curse of William's bloodline wasn't infighting, it was the impossibility of living up to his shadow. His descendants inherited his appetite for power, but none of his strategic patience. Where William spent years methodically crushing resistance, Henry II's temper alienated allies and drove his own sons to revolt. Where the Conqueror carefully balanced terror with calculated mercy, King John's capricious cruelty united England against him. Even Edward I, dubbed the English Justinian for his legal reforms, failed to replicate William's greatest trick, making oppression look like order. Most haunting of all is how thoroughly the Conqueror's worst traits outlived his virtues. His descendants' squabbles over inheritance ignited the anarchy, a civil war so brutal, chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept. The very castles William built to secure England became instruments of torture during Stephen and Matilda's conflict, their dungeons overflowing with political prisoners. And when the last direct Norman king, Stephen, died without a clear heir, the throne passed to Henry II, a Plantagenet whose violent mood swings and familial betrayals would have felt eerily familiar to the old Conqueror. Centuries later, the thread remains unbroken. Every English monarch from Henry VIII to Elizabeth II traces their lineage back to William, not through noble continuity, but through the same messy calculus of force and survival that defined his reign. The crown he seized with such brutality never truly settled on any head without controversy, as if the bloodstains on Hastings Field had seeped permanently into the fabric of English rule. The ultimate paradox: William's greatest legacy wasn't his laws or castles, it was the relentless, destabilizing ambition he bred into his line, a hunger that would shape kingdoms and topple thrones for 1,000 years. The science of bloodlines has turned William the Conqueror's legacy into a modern detective story, one where DNA strands matter as much as ancient charters. While most medieval kings fade into genealogical obscurity, William's genetic footprint sparked a 21st century frenzy when researchers realized his unique position, the last successful invader of England whose descendants intermarried with every subsequent royal line. The math seems straightforward: 8 centuries of monarchs from Henry II to Elizabeth II should carry traces of his DNA. But the truth is tangled in missing bones, disputed lineages, and a shocking revelation that nearly toppled a queen's public image. At the heart of the controversy lies a simple biological puzzle. William's remains were so thoroughly scattered during the French Revolution that extracting definitive genetic samples became impossible. Without his DNA, scientists turned to a process called reverse genealogy, tracing paper trails of his known descendants to living relatives. One study focused on the aristocratic Somerset family, direct male line descendants of William's illegitimate son, Henry Beauclerc. When their Y chromosomes were analyzed, they revealed a haplogroup rare in Britain but common among Norman nobility, offering tantalizing circumstantial evidence. But the real bombshell came when researchers overlapped these findings with Queen Elizabeth II's documented ancestry. The royal connection hinges on Matilda of Flanders, William's wife, whose bloodline weaves through generations like a golden thread. Through careful reconstruction of marriage records, geneticists demonstrated a 96% probability that Elizabeth inherited segments of Matilda's DNA. But here's where it gets messy. A rogue faction of historians challenged these results, arguing that royal genealogies are riddled with undocumented adoptions, false paternities, and outright forgeries, especially during the turbulent Plantagenet era. They pointed to Edward III's dubious claim to the French throne as evidence that medieval succession wasn't always biological. The debate turned explosive when a controversial 2016 paper suggested Elizabeth might share more DNA with Harold Godwinson than William, a poetic twist that would mean England's throne technically returned to Saxon blood despite Hastings. While later studies discredited this as statistical noise, the implications were staggering. If proven true, it wouldn't just rewrite history books, it would force a reckoning with the very foundation of royal legitimacy. The palace never officially commented, but courtiers privately dismissed the research as genealogical fantasy. What makes this more than academic squabbling is how DNA interacts with mythology. William's conquest wasn't just political, it was framed as a divine transfer of blood rights. Modern genetics, with its power to confirm or shatter such narratives, inadvertently revived ancient tensions. When researchers tested skeletons from the Battle of Toten, they found warriors on both sides shared remarkably similar DNA, proving Norman and Saxon genes had blended within generations. The Conqueror, who obsessed over pure lineage, left behind a kingdom where his biological mark became both everywhere and nowhere, diluted beyond recognition yet culturally indelible. Perhaps the final irony lies in the science itself. For all our high-tech tools, William's true genetic legacy may be fundamentally unknowable, not just due to missing samples, but because royalty's carefully constructed bloodlines were always more about power than chromosomes. The man who reshaped England with a sword now exists in our collective imagination as both a literal ancestor and a metaphorical ghost, his DNA scattered like his bones, present in theory, elusive in fact, and endlessly debated by those who still grapple with the weight of his shadow. William's death didn't just leave a throne vacant, it detonated a powder keg of pent-up rebellions, proving that decades of iron-fisted rule had papered over cracks rather than mended them. Within weeks of his burial, Normandy and England erupted in simultaneous revolts, as if his corpse's grotesque explosion at the funeral had been an omen for the coming chaos. In England, Saxon lords who'd bided their time under William's watch saw weakness in his heir, William Rufus, a brash, red-faced youth more interested in emptying treasuries than enforcing order. Meanwhile, Normandy became the stage for a surreal family feud, with eldest son Robert Curthose rallying disgruntled barons who'd long resented the Conqueror's heavy taxes and land grabs. The speed of this unraveling tells us something crucial about William's reign. His stability was always an illusion propped up by sheer force of personality. Take the case of Odo of Bayeux, the very half-brother William had imprisoned for treason. Freed on the dying king's orders, Odo immediately rallied Kentish nobles in a rebellion so fierce, Rufus had to torch entire villages along the coast to contain it. This wasn't just opportunism, it was proof that William's system of loyalty through terror collapsed the moment his grip slackened, even more telling. The rebels included Normans, not just Saxons. Men who'd fought alongside William at Hastings now turned their swords against his sons, preferring fractured anarchy to another generation of suffocating control. What's often overlooked is how geography dictated this collapse. William had spent his life straddling the Channel, personally suppressing flare-ups in Rouen 1 month and York the next. But his heirs lacked both his stamina and his intimate knowledge of local grudges. When Robert and Rufus split the kingdom, Normandy for Robert, England for Rufus, they created a power vacuum in the contested borderlands. Breton mercenaries who'd been kept in check by William's reputation now raided freely, while Flemish traders played both sides, smuggling weapons to rebels who promised better tariffs. The Conqueror's famed network of castles, once symbols of unshakable authority, became isolated outposts where garrisons starved as supply lines frayed. The rebellion's epicenter, though, revealed William's deepest miscalculation. In the north, the very region he'd harried into submission, Saxon remnants allied with Scottish King Malcolm III, who saw chaos as his chance to reclaim lost land. Villages that had grudgingly accepted Norman rule now welcomed Scottish troops with open arms, their hatred for William outweighing ancient rivalries. Rufus's eventual victory came at a horrific cost, a second harrying nearly as brutal as his father's, proving the cycle of violence hadn't been broken, merely paused. Most ironic of all was the fate of William's legal reforms. The Domesday Book, that masterpiece of control, became a weapon in rebel hands. Saxon clerics pored over its entries, using William's own records to prove which Norman lords had stolen lands beyond their legal allotments. In death, the Conqueror's obsession with documentation boomeranged. His meticulous audits now fueled the very unrest he'd sought to extinguish. The ultimate testament to William's unfinished legacy lies in what followed. Not a single one of his successors would rule both England and Normandy unchallenged. Less than a century after his death, the Anglo-Norman realm fractured completely under King John, its fragile unity shattered like the Conqueror's ruptured coffin. The tragedy isn't that William failed to foresee these rebellions. It's that he likely did, spending his final feverish days dictating warnings his sons were too arrogant to heed. The empire he built didn't see Arblee from external pressure, but from the same ruthless ambition he'd bred into his bloodline. In the end, the Conqueror who reshaped two nations discovered too late that no amount of force could compel the one thing he truly needed, heirs worthy of the weight he'd borne. By the 19th century, England had transformed William the Conqueror into something far more sinister than a medieval warlord. He became the villain of a national myth. The idea of the Norman yoke took root in Victorian imaginations, painting pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon England as a democratic utopia crushed under the boots of tyrannical Normans. Historians like Edward Augustus Freeman spun elaborate fantasies of Saxon freedom, where common folk gathered under ancient oak trees to vote on laws, their rights obliterated when William's knights stormed ashore. This wasn't just bad history, it was deliberate propaganda tailored to feed Britain's burgeoning nationalism and anti-aristocratic sentiment. The myth's staying power reveals more about Victorian anxieties than medieval realities. As industrialization upended traditional hierarchies, reformers seized upon the Norman yoke as a rallying cry. Chartists protesting for workers' rights invoked Harold Godwinson as a proto-populist martyr, while radical pamphlets claimed the Magna Carta wasn't a 13th century peace treaty, but a long overdue restoration of Saxon liberties. Even the language became weaponized. Philologists argued English had been pure before the conquest, sullied by Norman French additions like justice and nobility, terms now framed as foreign impositions. What makes this rewriting of history so fascinating is its selective amnesia. The Victorians glossed over uncomfortable truths about Anglo-Saxon England, its slave markets, its bloody succession crises, its rigid class structures. They ignored how William's Domesday Book preserved detailed records of Saxon landholdings precisely because those rights predated his arrival, the real irony. Many ancient liberties attributed to Saxons were actually Norman innovations, like the jury system William introduced to bypass corrupt local courts. The myth reached peak absurdity in popular culture. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe cemented the image of noble Saxons groaning under Norman oppression, while Victorian pageants featured actors in fake chainmail stomping on Saxon villagers. This fiction even shaped architecture. Mock Saxon revival homes sprouted across England, their rough-hewn beams and thatched roofs embodying a nostalgia for a past that never existed. Yet the Norman yoke wasn't entirely baseless. It drew power from real fractures in English society, the lingering resentment of displaced Saxon elites, the cultural scars of the harrying of the North. William's own actions fed the legend. His redistribution of lands to Norman barons created an alien ruling class that spoke French for generations. But the Victorians inflated these tensions into a cosmic struggle between liberty and tyranny, ignoring how Saxon and Norman cultures had blended within decades. The ultimate testament to the myth's potency, it still lingers. Modern phrases like Anglo-Saxon values carry unconscious echoes of this invented past, while Brexit debates saw politicians bizarrely invoking Hastings as a warning against foreign domination. William, the shrewd diplomat who married Saxon heiresses to Norman lords, would have scoffed at such simplifications. His conquest wasn't a clean break, but a messy synthesis, one that Victorian romantics rewrote to suit the prejudices of their age, proving that history is always inevitably a story told by the victor's descendants. The brutal warlord who once burned entire regions into submission is undergoing an unlikely transformation in modern scholarship, from ruthless conqueror to bureaucratic visionary. Recent historians have peeled back the layers of bloodshed to reveal William's overlooked genius for institution building, particularly in his revolutionary standardization of England's coinage. Before the Conquest, Anglo-Saxon mints produced coins of wildly varying weights and purities, making trade a gamble. William didn't just reform this system, he weaponized it. By 1080, every silver penny struck in England bore his stern profile, their weight so consistent that archaeologists can distinguish Norman coins from earlier issues by their precise uniformity alone. This wasn't mere vanity, it was economic warfare. The new currency became a daily reminder of royal authority in every peasant's palm, while the centralized mints at London, Winchester, and York starved regional elites of their traditional revenue from coin clipping. Even more striking was his restructuring of governance. While medieval kings typically ruled through personal charisma and ad hoc decrees, William engineered something startlingly modern, a proto-bureaucracy. His sheriffs, drawn from both Norman and surviving Saxon families, weren't just tax collectors, they were nodes in an information network. Monthly courts required written records of disputes, creating the earliest surviving court rolls in English history. The Domesday Book, often framed as a tax grab, functioned more like a medieval database, cross-referencing landholdings with productivity to prevent local lords from underreporting wealth. The most compelling rehabilitation comes from legal historians. William's much maligned forest laws, which reserved vast woodlands for royal hunting, are now recognized as early environmental protections. By criminalizing unauthorized logging and limiting grazing, these statutes preserved timber reserves crucial for shipbuilding, a strategic masterstroke that secured England's naval dominance for centuries. Even his brutal suppression of northern rebellions takes on new context when viewed alongside his simultaneous establishment of merchant guilds in York, suggesting the harrying wasn't just punishment, but a grim reset creating space for controlled economic revival. What's emerging from these reassessments isn't a sanitized William, but a nuanced pragmatist who understood that terror alone couldn't sustain an empire. His real legacy lies in the quiet revolutions, the way his standardized measures for cloth and grain survived into the industrial age, or how his blending of Norman and Saxon legal traditions created common laws dine. The conqueror who reshaped England with fire and sword also built the scaffolding of the modern state, proving that even history's most polarizing figures can't be reduced to simple monsters or heroes. The irony, the very systems he designed to consolidate power ultimately became tools for limiting it, as future English kings found themselves bound by the administrative machinery their Norman ancestor had welded into place. William the Conqueror's shadow stretches far beyond history books. It flickers across modern screens and pages, reshaped by every generation to suit its fears and fantasies. Shakespeare, who rarely met a historical figure he couldn't dramatize, conspicuously avoided William, perhaps finding the Conqueror's ruthless pragmatism too unsettling for Elizabethan audiences. Yet when the bard did sneak Normans onto the stage, they arrived dripping with irony. In Henry V, the chorus describes the vasty fields of France, once trampled by William's descendants, the same fields where Henry would later claim victory, proving how thoroughly conquests become cyclical. Fast forward to Hollywood's golden age, and William gets the swashbuckler treatment. 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood casts Normans as cartoonish villains twirling mustaches, with Basil Rathbone's Guy of Gisborne sneering about Norman justice. Never mind that the real William introduced trial by jury. These black-clad oppressors exist to make Errol Flynn's Saxon rogue look heroic. It's pure myth-making, recycling Victorian, Norman yoke tropes for Depression-era audiences craving underdog triumphs. Television twists the knife further. Vikings, Valhalla reimagines William's England as a fractured playground for Norse warlords, where Normans are just one faction among many scrambling for power. The show's Duke William glowering beneath a bowl-cut hairdo bristles with ambition, yet he's sidelined by the more photogenic Vikings. This inversion speaks volumes about our current obsessions. The Conqueror, who dominated 11th century Europe, now plays second fiddle to Ragnar Lothbrok's descendants in the battle for streaming supremacy. Literature offers sharper takes. Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth depicts Norman cathedral builders crushing Saxon traditions under Gothic arches, a metaphor for cultural erasure. But it's historical novelist Elizabeth Chadwick who gives William startling humanity in The Conquest, revealing the terrified boy behind the steel mask, a bastard who wept when his first warhorse was killed beneath him. The most revealing portrayals lurk in unexpected corners. A French children's cartoon from the 1990s, Les Tours de Bois Maury, casts William as a brooding anti-hero struggling with his conscience, proof that even former enemies now claim him. Meanwhile, British satire Horrible Histories reduces Hastings to a punk rock musical number, complete with Saxon and Norman boy bands trading insults. It's ridiculous, yet oddly faithful to the chaotic spirit of medieval propaganda. What ties these fragments together is their shared reluctance to confront William whole. We prefer our conquerors either demonic or saintly, not the messy reality of a man who rebuilt churches while starving rebels, who cherished his wife yet butchered her countrymen. Perhaps that's why no definitive biopic exists. His life resists tidy arcs. The closest we've come, the Bayeux Tapestry itself, now digitized and emoji-fied, its once sacred narrative flickering across smartphone screens. William would have approved. After all, this was a king who understood the power of a story stitched together. One thread for conquest, another for guilt, and 1,000 more left dangling for us to knot as we please. William the Conqueror's legacy is a tapestry woven with equal parts gold and blood, threads of visionary statecraft crossed with the stark brutality of a man who reshaped nations by force. These 30 facts reveal a ruler who could commission the Domesday Book, a masterpiece of administrative precision, yet slaughter thousands in the harrying of the North without flinching. He built cathedrals and castles that still stand centuries later, yet his own corpse was left nearly naked on the floor by fleeing servants, a bastard who clawed his way to power only to see his sons tear apart his empire. A king who standardized coinage and law, yet whose funeral smelled so foul it scattered mourners like leaves in a storm. Historians still grapple with this duality. Was he the architect of modern England, laying foundations for jury trials and centralized governance, or a warlord who drowned dissent in rivers of Saxon blood? The truth twists somewhere between. His reign proved that progress and cruelty could march hand in hand, that a man might gift a nation its bureaucratic soul while breaking its back with tyranny. Even his DNA lingers in modern royals, yet his bones were stolen, sold, or lost to time, as if history itself couldn't decide whether to venerate or vomit him up. So where does that leave us? Perhaps with the understanding that great figures are rarely great in ways we'd call moral. William's fingerprints are everywhere, in English land titles, in the Tower of London's shadow, in the very language we use to describe conquest. But his story also warns us legacy is fragile. The man who feared assassination daily died by his own gorged body. The king who demanded absolute control lost his empire to squabbling heirs. The conqueror who built for eternity couldn't keep his own tomb intact. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Which fact left you thunderstruck? Was it the funeral explosion, the eerie accuracy of the Bayeux Tapestry's propaganda, or the way his blood still flows in royal veins? Drop your pick in the comments. We're obsessed with these medieval paradoxes. And if you crave more tales of power, betrayal, and swords clashing in the fog, hit subscribe. Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by the curious. See you in the next